In this video, we're going to create the address repository, which is going to extend the Sprint Data JPA CRUD repository interface. And we will add one method there, which is going to be find all by user details. So I will go to my project and then source files, and we have folder that keeps all the repositories. And currently we have user repository there. So let's open it up to review. So when we created user repository interface, we needed to annotate it with the repository annotation to specify that this is going to be a Sprint Data JPA repository. And we had to first extend the CRUD repository interface. And later on, when we needed additional functionality, additional to create, read, update, and delete methods, we needed to extend it with paging and sorting repository. Well, for a list of addresses, we don't really need pagination because list of addresses is very short. We have only 2 records there, and we are not going to use pagination there. So for the addresses repository, we will simply extend CRUD repository so that methods that allow us to fetch data from database, save data to database, and then if needed update address records in database is already there and ready for us to use. So we will simply create a new repository. I will go to this package and create new interface, and I will call it address repository. And this interface will need to extend the Sprint Data JPA CRUD repository. So that's going to be CRUD repository. This is the one. Click on OK and click on Finish. Okay, so now we have this address repository interface that extends CRUD repository, and we will need to provide the data type of the entity, and our entity is address entity, and the ID, the primary ID of the address entity, which is a lone data type. So let's import address entity, and lone data type is because the database ID that is used as a primary key, which is being auto-incremented, is being defined in the address entity. So now if I open address entity, we have the generated value of ID type defined as lone. So let's close address entity for a minute and go back to address repository. So one important detail that we need to add to this address repository is the annotation that this is a repository. Okay, and I will import the repository from Spring Framework. And once I do that, all the methods that can help me to save information, to update information, to read information are already available to us by default. So if I go to address service and now I will import address repository, if I use this object address repository and type dot, see I have already methods like count, delete all, and find all, find by ID, many methods that allow me to communicate and fetch data from database and work with that data is already there, but there is no method that allows me to find user by user details. Remember that we need to fetch data from addresses table that belongs to user ID, and this user ID is the public user ID. It's not the database ID which is being auto-incremented like 1, 2, 3, 4. This is auto-generated user ID. If that was the database ID, then I could easily use method which is find all by ID and provide a database ID, and I will get back a list of address entities. But because we are using a different field to query records from a database, our method will need to be a little bit customized. Okay, so let's delete address repository and now look into find all by user details method. We need to fetch address entities from database, and we can fetch them either by ID or by other fields. So let me open address entity and look at the fields that I can use to query these records from a database. I can query records by ID, or I can query records by address ID, or by city, by country, street, postal code, type, and so on. But if I want to query for a list of addresses that belong to a particular user, then I need to query by the field name user details, which holds an object with encapsulated user details. So let's go to the addresses repository and define that method. So first of all, the method that we're defining will need to return a list. So I'm creating a list of address entities. The records that are being fetched from the database are returned as entity objects, and we have specified it here, address entity. So that's going to be list of address entities that is going to be returned. And now I will define a method name. So remember, in Spring Data JPA, if we want to perform save, then we need to start a method with the save. But if we want to find something, we start method with defined. If we want to find one record, then we can simply continue find by and then specify the name of the field that we will use, find by ID. But because we're querying a list of records, we will say find all, and then we will specify by which field we want to find. If we wanted to query the database by one specific field, which is in address entity, like for example ID, then we will specify find by ID. But because we want to search by user details like this, and we'll need to provide object as a method argument from which Spring Data JPA will be able to read that user ID. So that's going to be user entity, and I will call it just user. Or let's actually do entity, user entity, and let's import user entity like this. And let's import list. Okay, and now our method is ready. Let's just copy the method name find all by user details and make sure that inside of the address service it's also called find all by user details. Yes, everything is correct. So now when I have user controller with the method that is using address service to get addresses, and I have the get addresses method inside of addresses service implementation ready, and I have the address repository ready, I can actually run this application and see if I can get list of addresses, and our controller method to get list of addresses works. So let's try that.